Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us in the first of our series of co-learning webinars about the cumulative impacts rulemaking. I'm Maggie Winger. I supervise the agency rules and certification unit at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. This cumulative impacts rule is a priority for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and I can see that it's important to you because so many of you joined us at 1 o'clock this afternoon. Aspects of the law and rule are new to us, and part of the purpose of this webinar is for us to learn and for you to have a chance to learn and for us all to hear how programs like this work in other regions of the country, or at least that have similar components. Today, we're going to hear from 3 practitioners from other states who have worked on similar regulations. One important note for today, we are lucky to have our facilitation and engagement consultants joining us. DeYoung Consulting started this month under contract. We brought them on particularly because we know that this rulemaking is complex and it brings in a lot of different perspectives. And we have high engagement goals for this. I know that many of you have high engagement goals for this, and there's particular challenges in having good engagement around a topic that's this important to people and this technically complex. And so we really are looking to them for outside help to make sure that everyone is able to participate in the process and be heard, and that what we hear is reflected in a rule when that goes on notice. I'm going to pass it off to Anna Peters from DeYoung Consulting, although a few other team members are here. Thank you again all for joining us today. Anna?
Thank you, Maggie, and welcome to everyone. It's great to see such a showing. I'm Anna Peters with DeYoung Consulting Services, and I'm joined by my 2 teammates, and I'll have them introduce themselves in a second. DeYoung Consulting Services, very briefly, as a team, we do a lot of organization development, which for us means a lot of community listening for mission-driven organizations. And so that's what we are doing with the MPCA, working with them to design these webinars and working sessions to achieve their goals. Vanessa and Amy, do you want to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, my name is Vanessa Steele, and I'm also a consultant with DeYoung Consulting Services. And like Anna said, we like to support organizations as they go through change and engage with communities and want to be bear witness to that and support that process. So I'm glad to be here. You want to go ahead, Amy?
Hi, everyone. We're happy you're here today. My name's Amy Snetting, and I am one of 2 project managers at DeYoung Consulting Services. So I handle logistics and help get things to where they need to be.
So today's objectives are really quite simple. We will be doing a lot of learning, and like Maggie said, we have some guest speakers who you will hear from. So we'll learn about what they're doing in their areas of the country and lessons they've learned that may apply to Minnesota. And then the second objective is to gather public insight. So that's you, gather your insight into this process, into the cumulative impacts analysis process.
So part of that process is there have been 4 to 5 webinars that PCA has engaged a community with. We'll also be doing interviews with key stakeholders, and we'll also be doing 4 to 5 working sessions starting in the beginning of the summer, so I believe June. And so really the public engagement process will be vital for implementing the law, essentially. Without community voice, we cannot move forward. And so it's absolutely vital that you're involved. Ooh, let me go back one, sorry. Trying to see this slide. But really, it's important that as you look at this work, a final statement of needs and reasonableness report will be presented to the administrative law judge, and we will be seeking insight from the community on that.
Yeah, specifically, so I know this is a lot of text, but this is basically a scope of, you're jumping around, a scope of what the public's insight is, what MPCA is looking for. So I will read it, but of course you can follow along. So first, establish benchmarks regarding the need for a cumulative impacts analysis, and also establish the required content of that analysis and provide public information regarding environmental stressors that are present in an environmental justice area. So just as a note, when you see EJ, that's what that stands for, is environmental justice, as I'm sure many of you know. Also, define conditions, the criteria or circumstances that establish an environmental or health impact as a substantial adverse impact. Establish the content of a community benefit agreement and the procedures for entering into that agreement. Establish a petition process to support the need for an analysis. Establish a process by which a tribal government can elect to apply this section to a permit application. And establish methods for holding public meetings and handling public comments. So there is a lot. It's very broad, and all of you may have one area of interest, or you may have many areas of interest, but your insight is sought after for all of these. Thanks, Vanessa.
Yeah, sorry. So as you can see, the agenda, we began at 1 promptly. And then we're gonna have our speakers, our guest speakers, Dr. Esther Min, who's going to talk about how to incorporate inclusive community engagement and cumulative impact indicatives, excuse me. And then Kandyce Perry will also be sharing with us how New Jersey cumulative impact law is being enacted. And then at 1:50, Dr. Anna Baptista will have a presentation on EG strategy for strong cumulative impact laws in New Jersey's rulemaking. And then we'll go through a Q&A and a closing. And I wanted to add that what we'll do is after each speaker presents, we'll have a very short period, like a couple minutes, just to ask clarifying questions. And then we will ask all the larger questions across the presentations at the end. That's why we have more of the time there. Did you want to add anything, Anna?
Only that I can share a little bit about what the 3 speakers will be speaking about. And of course, we'll give them their full 20 minutes, but just to give people kind of frame it up so you know what to expect. So Dr. Esther Min will speak first, and she will be presenting experiences from Washington State on how to incorporate inclusive community engagement in cumulative impact indicatives. So cumulative impacts from environmental pollution can be complex, multifaceted, and it requires engaging in complex phenomena to ultimately provide tangible outcomes for communities. So that is her topic, and she can share about that. And then we will hear from, like Vanessa said, Kandyce Perry, and who is the director in New Jersey's Office of Environmental Justice. And she's had a vital role in implementing the cumulative impacts rule, so very relevant. And Ms. Perry will be discussing how New Jersey's cumulative impact law is being enacted after a meaningful rulemaking process was completed. And then our third speaker, Dr. Ana Isabella, I believe, if I got that right. I think there was a missing name in there, Baptista. We will hear from her as she'll cover community engagement and New Jersey's cumulative impact rulemaking process. So similar region, but different role. So key aspects of their process involved environmental justice coalitions with holistic stakeholder engagement, the timing and the process of the rule, the main outcomes of this process, and what is ahead for New Jersey.
So I'm going to stop sharing so Dr. Esther can share her presentation. Does that sound good?
All right, can folks see my actual screen with the slides, not the notes?
Yes.
Looks good.
All right. So I'm going to set my timer just so I don't run over. All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Esther, she, her pronouns. I am based in Seattle, Washington at the University of Washington here. And wanted to introduce, as folks have already mentioned, our Washington Environmental Health Disparities Map, and especially how that was shaped through community direction and community input. And so this is what it looks like as a static map. It's an interactive map, actually, that you can go in and kind of click around, zoom in, search things. And but didn't want to focus on that because that could be a whole nother webinar. We, as a partnership, and I'll show you who those were in a moment, we created a map that really shows both the social and the environmental inequities that exist, whether somebody lives closer to a hazardous waste sites, which then, of course, if there's an accident, for example, then the exposure or what people come into contact with might be higher or more dangerous for that community versus if you lived much further away and whatnot. And so this is a statewide map that really gives you that glimpse of what that community conditions look like on the ground. Wanted to make sure that I share what our definition of cumulative impacts is. I will note that this is not defined in statute or anything here. This is what the working group and the team behind the map has come up with. And for some of you that are familiar with other screening tools or EJ screening tools, it models similarly, where we refer to cumulative impacts as the combined impact of multiple environmental health indicators on a population. So not just individuals that are part of that population, but also community health as a whole. And so I wanted to introduce and talk about the timeline a bit, because for us, this is quite significant in the creation of the tool too, and also where community got started with the conversation. In late 2016, community groups actually started to look for and approach technical partners, myself included at University of Washington, to look for partners to help create the an environmental justice tool. At the time, we didn't name it Environmental Health Disparities Map, but to really think about how do you communicate the burden from environmental hazards and harms along with the community level vulnerability in a way that's easy to explain to someone that doesn't live there, right? And we've seen through COVID, what happens if you have COVID concerns with potentially, say, wildfire smoke. Do you let the kids out for recess? Do you keep them in? What do you do? And so thinking about, how to convey that in an easy to communicate way. And so in 2016 and very early beginnings of 2017, the community groups actually in Washington State brought together various different technical partners. And as you can see, that was so many years ago, and now it's actually, the tool is now in law in Washington State. And so we actually started as a hodgepodge of people from communities, from academia, from governmental agencies, where everybody understood the need for, or to support the need for, an environmental justice map to, again, convey the different things I just described. And so front and centered is the coalition of community organizations on the ground, rooted in community, that really called the need for this tool. Full disclaimer, I work part-time for University of Washington, part-time for Front and Center now, after years and years of collaboration. And the technical partner from the academic side was Environmental and Occupational Health Sciences, which I was a student at the time with multiple faculty members. And we said, yes, let's actually work together. What the community is asking for is what we should be creating as tools and developing research. And then you'll notice we have 2 state agencies that also said, yes, we'll partner. We'll figure out how to make this work. It was Department of Health, that has the Environmental Public Health Tracking Network. It's part of the CDC network. And so about, I think, half the states across the nation have that tracking platform and the tool and a team. And so they said, we already have a platform. If the team or the group advises on what indicators to put in there, what are stressors for communities, how do you combine them together, we can display it. We already do that. It fits within our role. We already have the platform. Yes, we'll be happy to. And then Department of Ecology for the state of Washington is our state agency that manages and regulates many of the environmental things, including air quality, water quality, et cetera. And so they, being kind of the keepers of the data, said, yes, we will, of course, be partners for this and help figure out who might be the right person to bring in for the data conversation. And then Puget Sound Clean Air Agency is a regional regulatory agency for our state of Washington. There are many different clean air agencies. And this particular clean air agency has had a lot of experience mapping and thinking about equity and communities, making sure they're not left behind if they're left behind in the past, really making sure that the engagement is done well from a regulatory agency perspective. And they said we'd be more than happy to partner. And so this is how kind of the team got together, again, under the direction of and the call from the community. And so after we kind of discussed what our role was, took many meetings, but really got clarity and expectations of what we wanted from each other to make sure that it was a successful conversation. We really built trust, over time. Our plan was to build trust over time so we can ask each other questions and know that it's not, hidden with all of the different intricacies, but really just, honest relationships that we wanted to build across the different boundaries and organizations. And so we actually prioritized these listening sessions, as we called it, especially coming out of some of the lessons learned for different agencies and different states and nationally, a lot of the tools were really driven by agency staffers or maybe a legislative directive. And so knowing those things, oftentimes it could have a flavor of a top-down approach. And so we really wanted to make sure that for our tool here in Washington State, it was grounded and rooted in community and their experiences and their voices. And so front and center, it actually leveraged the funding that they had to host and support other groups in the network to have a multicultural lingual conversation about how they might be impacted by the pollution or by the changing climate or by the different sensitivity that, say, somebody with asthma might have, and the resilience of it all, right? We're not all just experiencing hunger, we all are resilient people as well. And especially for Washington State, these 4 groups on the screen: communities of color, households with lower incomes, immigrants and refugees, and linguistically isolated groups, were often left out of conversations in the past. And so we really wanted to make sure that we listened to them. And we framed these 2 questions, which actually was very enriching for us when we were developing all the indicators and the stressors, if you will. One was, what kinds of pollution, if any, are impacting your life or work and that of your family and community? And we really made sure to frame it that way so people were thinking about not just themselves individually and their immediate family, but also the community around them, right? And so thinking about what might affect their ability to be able to respond to a harm, or when there is a harm, what to do, which led to the second question, which is what factors best show if your community is healthy or doing well compared to other communities. And in just asking these 2 simple questions, it was, an hour and a half to 2 hour long conversations with 10 to 40 people in a room. This was like 2017, so everything was in person. We didn't even think about a virtual option back then. And people really thought about, like health and well-being connected to the children and the next generation, connected to like food and food systems and cost of living and jobs, housing quality. And so like everything that you might imagine, comes in up in people's mind when you think about what helps or harms people, especially when you have the environment and the community in mind. And so from what the community talked about, we then went to the literature and the science to look at, well, what does the data say the relationship is, so we know kind of where to put and develop those indicators, or what kind of data might or might not exist, so we know whether it'll be ready for this first version or not. And so we spent quite a bit of time really thinking and figuring out, where does it fit? Does it fit within the definition that we had framed? And again, like these were definitions that we had written ourselves using the framework that other places like California with the CalEnviro screen had used. And so for environmental exposures, really think about what is harming, or what can you measure that we know is harmful to the community. And then environmental effects category, housing, things that might characterize the environment around you that can cause potential harm or hazard. And then of course, the other 2 talking about both individual level vulnerability. So if you have cardiovascular disease and you're exposed to really bad air quality on a bad air day, your experience or your health outcome might be a lot worse than if you were healthy and exposed to that bad air quality. And then the last category, being very important for these tools and for Washington State as well, is the community's characteristics or socioeconomic factors that might change the way that you can cope with or respond to a environmental harm or hazard in your community. I will say, one of the things that community members really mentioned was life expectancy, being very having a lot of disparities in our state, as many other states do, with our community groups that tend to do well and whatnot. The discrepancy of life expectancy often can be, I think, up to like, say, 14 years for some of the communities that we know are facing these multiple harms on them. And so we spent quite a bit of time with the community and with the technical team talking about, where does that indicator fit? Does it fit? Because of course it's not an environmental thing. It's kind of a sensitive population maybe. If we're thinking about low life expectancy as a proxy measure or alternative to measuring, the general chronic conditions of health, right? Because that's the ultimate health outcome. And we want to, increase the life expectancy. Or is it actually the ultimate outcome measure itself? So do we leave it out of this model, and do we just make sure after we create this map, we just compare it later on to see how it looks for life expectancy? And maybe that's how we track progress over time, is in general for population characteristics, are things improving, or are they just collectively getting worse or staying the same? And so we spent 4 months, really in-depth, work group conversations with community staffers from organizations, with agency, with UW, all talking about each of these buckets and really making sure that what we had heard from community really reflects. And you might say, well, Esther, there's like water. It's one of the biggest word on the screen for this word cloud. And so that was one where we, especially in the Pacific Northwest, along with, many other communities, the way we interact with water is very important to people because we have marine water. There's a lot of fishing, there's a lot of indigenous population relies on the health of the fish, the salmon and the clams. There's also a lot of surface water that people also interact with or see when they're hiking and whatnot. But there weren't as many indicators or data sets that were readily available to turn into indicators at the time. And so we knew that, we flagged it along with multiple other indicators that I'll list in a little bit, but really thinking about what data is ready to go and then what data that we want to put in. And we made sure to inform the community to say, well, this is the plan. This isn't meant to be a one-time and done thing like some research projects end up being. This is designed to be iterative. Department of Health is really hoping to update the tools as it's in there with the data. We had some data requirements because of that to make sure that the source of data was from the priority was if it was a governmental agency of sort, whether it's federal or state that owned the data, then of course those would be maintained and they're standards, and it's easier to kind of maintain those once it's in the system versus a one-off research group came up with the data set, then those might be harder to maintain. So we kind of had several of those. And so ultimately for our tool, we actually put different census tracts into deciles. And so if you look at kind of the bottom of your screen, community groups are ranked 1 to 10, 10 being like the most impacted by all these cumulative burdens and 1 being the least impacted. And so about 10% of the communities or census tracts would be in the same similar bucket. And so the more darker red you go, the more impacted you are. We did change the color scheme ultimately. I think now it's purple light to dark because of we wanted to make sure the map was accessible for especially those that might have different levels of color blindness. And so in the short remaining time I have left, just wanted to give some examples of how we're utilizing the tool. And so we released the tool in early 2019 as version 1.0. And then we actually had a law passed called the Healthy Environment for All, passed in 2021. And so now we're kind of in the thick of implementation of that law. And so in there, the obligations to maintain the tool actually got passed on, more formally to Department of Health. And they're now required to track changes over time. In addition to maintaining the tool, they're working on documentation, public summary, really making sure that they can engage both the community in a way that the community wants to and should be engaged for tools like this, along with their task to develop the technical guidance and trainings for agencies and practitioners so it's utilized correctly, because there are wrong ways to use the tool and there are better ways to use the tool. And so really thinking about those, Department of Health is now kind of leading that, and my role and my department's role has changed to be a support role. So behind the scenes, helping draft the report and doing some analyses. And these work still continues, like we're updating existing indicators with newer data sources or up-to-date, years of data. Some things might need more modeling or more development, like some of the water quality indicators that I had mentioned. And we're working on developing brand new indicators, for example, pesticide, especially for Washington State. We have a huge, agricultural community. And so making sure that those farm workers, we capture those exposures. And so we have a lot of these conversations ongoing. And wanted to give just a couple examples of how we've applied the tool. One is Department of Ecology is using some of the rankings and indicators to inform different activities, including public participation planning or site assessment or various environmental justice review, not a formal environmental justice review like a SEPA or NEPA might be. It's just a framing for our state. And then another example of how Department of Ecology used the tool is for our Washington State's cap and trade bill. There is a specific section that focuses on improving air quality for communities. And for the department, they wanted to look at the different environmental justice screening tools to start to use as one of the filters to get to the ultimate overburdened communities that they will then do more monitoring and really, work on reducing the air pollution for. And so as you can see here on the left, you had to have a rank 9 or a 10 for the environmental health disparities rank, or for US EPA's EJ screen, particularly demographic index, a 90th percentile or above, or if you were on tribal land. And then once you kind of filtered once, then of those communities who had elevated criteria air pollution. And so ultimately refined boundaries and ended up with 16 communities that Department of Ecology has designated as like the first set of 16 communities that are designated overburdened, and now currently working on setting out air monitoring and sensors and whatnot to make sure they have the data to then take action afterwards in reducing air pollution or improving air quality. So I will stop my presentation there, and my email's on here, but happy to also answer questions right now, quick questions right now before we get to more conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Min. We do want to just have a few moments for clarifying questions, and we saw a few in the chat. And if folks don't mind using the raising their hands, but do you see the few in the chat, Claire? Do you want me to read them out to you?
I do. From what I see from the top, there's one. What role did the Department of Ecology contribute to discussion and program development? For specifically the development of the environmental health disparities map, there was like a team of 1 for somebody that did environmental justice for the Department of Ecology, and she was working with us on the actual working group to help think about and bring in the other technical partners as needed, and connected me with all the water quality folks and then the air folks. And so they had a very significant role in shaping the conversation and also making sure the data that we were using and adopting was the most relevant and also what was most feasible technically, since if the agencies are using the tool and it's their data and they can stand behind it, that's the ideal model of these environmental justice screening tools.
And then I think we have time for that second one. Do you see the one
Okay.
that says was the health? You got that one?
Yep, was the health or integrity of the community supporting natural ecosystems considered as an exposure factor? So I'm not sure, we might have to unpack like natural ecosystems too, because for our framework, we focused a lot around a community's experience with environmental harm, knowing that there's also a lot of supporting things from being so close to, nature. Here in 30 or 45 minutes, you can get to very great hiking places up here in Washington State. And so thinking about what those, resiliency factors are that helps communities not just cope, but become more resilient and actually get better health, right? Better mental health, better health. And so there are so many aspects of that our framework just did not capture, but communities have highlighted that. And so we always have in mind, and a lot of people are thinking about, like, how do you really model and capture that resilience factor that does make people healthy? And I wonder if that framing could potentially go in there, just depending on how you might frame that natural ecosystem. All right, I guess more conversation to come later.
Thanks so much, Dr. Min. That was very interesting to hear and see all the mapping and the tool that you developed. So thank you for that. And if anybody has additional questions specifically for any of the speakers, we will have time at the end. So if a thought occurs to you, it is not lost, and you can always put it in the chat. And if we have so many comments and questions that we can't get to them all, we will capture them anyway. So MPCA will have a record of those. We will transition now to hear from Kandyce Perry. And Kandyce, do you have your content up? Would you like to share? Would you like us to share?
I've got it up. Yep. Let me just share my screen.
Looking good. Thank you.
All right, I'm all set. So, hi everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Kandyce Perry from New Jersey. And so my job today is to give you an overview of the environmental justice law and rules in New Jersey and kind of show you the mechanics of how it works. And then I'll pass it over to my colleague, Baptista, who will give you more of the behind the scenes of the New Jersey approach and how we got here through community engagement and stakeholdering. So thanks so much to the team from Minnesota for inviting me to present. So the environmental justice law was passed by our legislature and signed by our governor in September 2020. And then we took about two and a half years to develop our regulations that implement the law, which were adopted April 2023. And so I just want to go through, before we dive into the meat of it, just some declarations that you'll find directly in the legislation that really sets a tone and a pathway for how my agency, the Department of Environmental Protection, was intended to implement the law. And so I'll just read through these pretty briefly. The legislature finds and declares that all New Jersey residents, regardless of who they are, deserve to live, work, and recreate in a clean and healthy environment. Historically, New Jersey's communities are subject to disproportionately high number of stressors from pollution, from sources from industrial, commercial, and governmental facilities located in those communities. And that the legacy of citing sources of pollution in those overburdened communities continues to pose a health-based threat, and that it's past time for the state to correct those historical injustices. The declarations go on to say that no community should bear a disproportionate share of that pollution, and that the state's overburdened communities must have a meaningful opportunity to participate in decisions that affect their quality of life, and that it is in the public interest of the state, where appropriate, to limit the future placement and expansion of such facilities in those overburdened communities. And so we're really fortunate to have those declarations that sets the tone for what we were intended to do as an agency in our rulemaking. And that last bullet really speaks to the goal for our rulemaking. And so the goal is to avoid disproportionate impacts and to ask ourselves a simple question of, are some communities, based on who they are, experiencing more pollution, and disproportionately so, than others? And if so, we have a responsibility as an agency to do something about that. And I'll talk about the mechanism for what we do about that in a few slides later. But also our goal is to avoid disproportionate impacts. And so a disproportionate impact in our rulemaking is defined in two ways. So a facility can create adverse cumulative stressors within an overburdened community as a result of that facility moving into that community. So when they move in, they will contribute adverse cumulative stressors in that community. Or another scenario could be the facility contributes to those stressors in an overburdened community that is already experiencing adverse cumulative stressors. So we'll talk about those two scenarios as we move along. But let's first start with, I'll go through in my slides, 3 steps for the environmental justice rules and how they work. The step 1 is to determine where the rules are applicable, and we have 3 criteria to do that. So the first is the rule will be applicable if it is located within an overburdened community. Second, if the facility in question is defined as one of these 8 types of facilities listed below. So a major source of air pollution, an incinerator, sewage treatment plant, transfer station, a recycling facility, and so on. And 3, whether or not one of those 8 types of facilities that's located or proposing to be located within an overburdened community is requesting a specific type of permit from the department. So a solid waste permit, a recycling permit, air or water pollution permit. When all 3 of those triggers or criteria are met, that's when the EJ rules are applicable. So we'll get into some definitions and some background. So the definition of overburdened community is a statutory definition. And so it is a community defined at block group level where at least 35% of our households are low income, at least 40% of the residents identify as minority or as a member of a state recognized tribe, or at least 40% of those households have limited English proficiency. The emphasis here is on the word or, so you only need to meet one of these 3 criteria in order to be defined as an overburdened community. It's an or, not an and we did that intentionally to provide as comprehensive of a reach across our state to define and really track these communities that may be subject to disproportionate amounts of pollution. And so if you look at the numbers, about 50 or about 52% of the state's population live within overburdened communities at the block group level. Out of 564 of the state's municipalities, there are 380 and 60 that have overburdened communities within their municipal boundaries. Just a little bit more on definition. So when we look at the definition of overburdened community as compared to the definition of an environmental justice community, it's a tiered approach. So the definition for overburdened community that we just talked about is your circle in blue. If you layer on top of that, the presence of disproportionate environmental and public health stressors, and we'll look at that definition in a minute, along with the absence of environmental and public health benefits. So we're talking about open space, parks, tree canopy, green infrastructure, things like that. The nexus of those three is what constitutes an environmental justice community in New Jersey. And so there is a way to visualize where these OBCs and environmental justice communities are located, and that's through our EJ map, so our environmental justice mapping, assessment, and protection tool. So when you arrive on the tool, just have some screenshots for you to show you how it works. You'll see a map of New Jersey. If you zoom in a bit more, you can see two color codings here on the legend. You'll have adjacent and you'll have OBC. So OBC in that tealish green. And then just want to make a note to point out adjacent. So these are adjacent block groups or block groups that are immediately adjacent to an overburdened community. But those block groups that have zero population as defined or as according to the US Census. So this is really important to keep track of because zero population block groups, you can think of it as a port location. We want to track and make sure that we're keeping aware of where those zero population block groups are immediately abutting up against overburdened communities so that those two are falling under our environmental justice regulations so that we can have this public process that will determine if a power plant, for example, wanted to move into a port, we can make sure that that power plant is captured under our regulations and are not unduly affecting and contributing to stressors to those immediately adjacent block groups. So we have both the OBCs and those zero population block groups that are immediately adjacent to those OBCs. If you drill down a bit further, there's a way to see the block groups based on their individual criteria. So remember I said before, you just need an or. So some are defined OBC based on their limited English proficiency, some based on low income, some based on minority, and then some based on the combination of those three. You can also look at the facilities. So there's a facilities tab along the top, and this will allow you to visualize where all of the 8 types of facilities that are defined in the environmental justice law are located throughout the state, defined by a different kind of color coding symbol there. And then lastly, this is what I like to call the meat of the tool, our stressor summary tab. This is where you shift from overburdened communities to seeing where overburdened communities that are subject to adverse cumulative stressors throughout the state are located. And those are color coded by a darker blue and a lighter blue. I'm going to get into the meat of how this works and the methodology behind it and those 2 color codings in just a second. But I do want to just go into our environmental and public health stressors. So in our legislation, our legislators told the agency and defined environmental and public health stressors are means of sources of environmental pollution, including but not limited to these 5 kind of categories, or conditions that may cause potential public health impacts, including but not limited to, then there's 5 categories. So from there, our job as an agency was to look at and generate a list of specific environmental and public health stressors in each of those categories. And we did that through a very robust stakeholdering process where we asked the public and came up with a list of about 60 stressors and then whittled that down to 26. So our goal here was to use the minimum amount of stressors that would make for a meaningful environmental justice analysis. So to use just the minimum amount of stressors that would dictate or help us to determine where disproportionate amounts of pollution are located throughout the state. And so I just have a list of where those individual stressors where we fell and including those individual stressors. And really it was based on the availability of publicly available and statewide data sources. And that's where we end up. So we have air, water, land, land use type of stressors and also stressors that may cause public health issues as a proxy, because we do not have public health data within EJMAP. The resolution of having public health data at the block group level just wasn't meaningful for us to visualize. And because of HIPAA reasons, we're not able to include public health data at the scale that we need. So we have these proxies, those that may cause public health issues included within the tool, as well as stressors for our social determinants of health. So back to the map and back to this darker blue versus lighter blue and kind of explaining to you the methodology behind how this tool works. So if you zoom in a bit further, you can click on a block group that's in that darker blue. It will bring up this pop-up box. And then there's a little hyperlink to a PDF that will pop up if you click it. And so this is all the underlying data for this one specific block group that has been determined to be an overburdened community. And so I'll walk you through this math and how it works. So we have our 26 stressors listed on the left. So this is just a screenshot of just a few of them. If you were to keep scrolling, you'll see all of the 26 stressors. So if we just take the first one highlighted in yellow, is ground level ozone. So this is asking you, what are the average number of days in a 3-year period that are above the standard for ground level ozone? And then you want to look at what that value is for this one specific block group. Remember, there's like 3,000 block groups across the state of New Jersey, overburdened block groups. So that's your value in blue. So it's saying that there's about 2.6, 2.7 days within a 3-year period where the average, where the ground level ozone level is above the standard. And so then we want to compare this to a geographic point of comparison. And so this is how New Jersey does our cumulative impact analysis. It's really through a comparative analysis. We want to compare the block group in question to a geographic point of comparison. So we've defined it either as the county or the state at the 50th percentile. And we're going to compare that overburdened block group to the non-overburdened block groups in the county or state to determine whether or not this stressor is higher than or lower than. And so we're going to look at both values. So the circle in red is the county. So their value is 2.3. And then the value in green for the state is 0.99. And again, we're looking at the 50th percentile. So for the geographic point of comparison, we want to pick the lower of the two. This gives us the most comprehensive look at determining disproportionate amounts of pollution. So lower of the two is 0.99, of course. And so in the column all the way to the right, you're going to see a yes. So this yes means that yes, for this one block group, this one overburdened block group, for the ground level ozone stressor, this is an adverse stressor for this block group. Then we'll just do that same math where we'll look at the value for the block group. We'll compare it to the 50th percentile, looking at the non-overburdened block groups, take the lower of the two, and it'll be a yes or a no. And so you can see at the right, there's a yes, there's a no, there's a yes, there's a no. And so the next thing we want to do is just count. We just simply want to count the total number of yeses. And so for this block group, our total count is 24. Remember, we have 26 stressors total. So 24 out of the 26 are adverse stressors for this block group. But again, to determine whether it's higher than, like to determine disproportionality, we have to compare it to something else. So we also want to look at, well, what's the total count of yeses for the county? And what's the total count of yeses for the state? So for this county, it's 12. And for the state, it's 13. We want to take the lower of the two. The lower will be 12, of course. And because 24 is higher than 12, we're determining that this block group is subject to adverse cumulative stressors. It's higher than the 50th percentile. And so therefore will be highlighted in that blue, that darker blue, where it says higher than the 50th percentile. And so that's kind of the mechanics of the behind the scenes of how the tool works and how it gets those darker blue and those lighter blue block groups. So let's keep moving along with our process. I told you there are 3 steps within our environmental justice rule. Step 2 is our environmental justice impact statement and our public participation process. So if you are subject to the rules, we're going to require the applicant to do an environmental justice impact statement. So in that impact statement, you'll have to document the potential for your facility to contribute to adverse cumulative stressors, what are the public environmental and public health stressors that are already borne by the overburdened community? And if your facility is going to contribute to environmental and public health stressors negatively and that overburdened community, what are some of the measures where you can avoid, minimize, and mitigate those contributions? And so that's what the impact statement does. The next thing we do is we require the applicant to share and present that aegis, as we call it, in front of the overburdened community in question. So there's a public hearing, and it gives the overburdened community an opportunity to comment on that aegis and to let the department know what they think about this facility in question. And so remember, our goal is to avoid a disproportionate impact, either when a facility is coming in and they're going to contribute to the adverse cumulative stressors, or there's already adverse cumulative stressors, and they're going to add more adverse cumulative stressors to that community. And so in step 3, the department has a decision to make. So you have an applicant that is subject to the EJ rules. They're going to prepare their environmental justice impact statement using the baseline information within our EJ map. And then they're going to hold a public hearing within the overburdened community. They're going to give that community an opportunity to comment and testify and give feedback to the applicant and the department. And so then we take all of that information, everything that we heard in the public hearing, the testimony, and the written comments to make a decision. And so this is where our law and our rules empower us to have an outcome in these scenarios. So where the facility can avoid a disproportionate impact, remember that's our goal, the department will authorize the applicant to proceed. We will approve the permit, but we'll set conditions in the permit to ensure that a disproportionate impact remains avoided. Now, where a facility cannot avoid a disproportionate impact, the department has 2 pathways. For new facilities, the department has to deny the application outright unless the applicant can demonstrate that it serves a compelling public interest in the overburdened community. So this is a project that serves specifically the overburdened community and provides a benefit to that OBC, not a broad societal benefit, but a specific benefit to the OBC. If it cannot demonstrate that it will serve that compelling public interest, the facility must deny the application for that new facility. For expanded facilities and major source renewals, the department will authorize the applicant to proceed, but we will set conditions to the permit to ensure that environmental and public health stressors, that there are not additional contributions and impacts to environmental and public health stressors. So what we mean by conditions in this instance is something like a dust mitigation plan or a traffic recirculation plan, where we're requiring the applicant to recirculate diesel trucks around the overburdened community and not directly through the overburdened community. For example, there are many more other solutions, including advanced control technologies and converting equipment to renewable energy, for example, that we hope to come up in those public hearings and from the community. This is an opportunity for the community to let us know which conditions they would like to see in the permit. And we're again going to take that feedback as we make a decision on which conditions to place in the permit. So with that, I'll stop. I'll leave these slides with the organizer of the webinar. There's a bunch of links and tutorials and trainings and presentations and FAQs for you to explore if you'd like to learn further. And this is me. So thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Kandyce. That was fascinating. We did get a few questions, and let me go through them very quickly. So Jill asked if we could get a copy of the presentation. So the recording of the presentations or the whole webinar will be posted on the website. So if anyone wants something in addition to that, maybe put into the chat what you would like, and to see if MPCA can accommodate that. We have a question: who and how is the size or area of each block group determined? And then there was a response by the group. So Kandyce, I'll see if does this answer the question. Block groups are determined by the U.S. Census Bureau. They all have about 700 residents, but vary in size.
That's right. That's right. And just to add additional context, the block group is the lowest point of geographic information that the census provides data for. So you have a block group, you have a tract, you have a zip code, municipality, a county, a state. So.
Great, thank you. And then we have a comment that I think it is a strong recommendation to MPCA. So instead of reading that out loud, because it's not a question directly for Kandyce Perry, we will document that and see if if MPCA has a comment at the end of when we get to the Q&A. The 50th percentile, is the 50th percentile of the stressor levels based off of median or the mean?
The median. So basically what we say, the 50th percentile for the non-overburdened communities, you want to look at that ozone value. You want to line up all of the overburdened community, the non-overburdened communities, ozone values from least to greatest, and take the middle value, which will be the 50th percentile median. So all of the ozone values from least to greatest for the non-overburdened communities, take the middle. That's going to be your non-OBC 50th percentile median value.
Thank you. I want to make sure we have enough time for our third speaker. But I know that there are more comments coming in. So why don't we, and we will not ignore them. We want to just make sure that we have enough time for the presentation. So I will let Dr. Baptista share her slides, and then we'll get to the general Q&A. We'll get through as many of these questions as we can. Does that work?
Great. Can everybody see the slides all right? Yeah. And Kandyce, you did a marvelous job going through some very dense materials. So I'm super impressed. But yeah, I'm happy to join you all and very excited that Minnesota is embarking on this journey of rulemaking. And I'm here to tell you that this is one of the most important points of this journey, is the rulemaking process. You know, I'm a professor at the New School. I run a center there, but I'm also had the pleasure of being part of a coalition of environmental justice organizations in New Jersey that worked for many, many years, for decades, on passing some sort of substantive environmental justice or cumulative impacts law in the state of New Jersey. And I'll tell you that that effort did not just culminate in September 2020 when the governor signed the law. It really culminated in April 2023 when we actually got the rule implemented in a very strong fashion. So it takes a long time. It's a long process. And for the EJ advocates on the phone call and the regulators on the call, you know, this is one of the most important aspects that I myself didn't really fully appreciate till I got to spend this very intensive period in this coalition working on rulemaking. So I'm going to share a little bit about that process of you know, post enactment of the legislation, what it really took to try to as a coalition of EJ advocates who are really invested in seeing a strong law turn into a strong rule, what the effort really took on the collaboration and the input that went into that, and maybe some hints or advice along the way for those of you embarking on that journey now in Minnesota. I will say that say a little bit about this coalition. It is really important. I want to echo what Esther talked about in Washington State, which is that these efforts are strongest in terms of implementing and seeing these rules and laws through to implementation when they are led by the communities that are directly impacted by pollution and the legacy of environmental injustice. It is so important that the groups on the ground that are closest to these impacts are intimately involved in the political strategy and in the legislative and technical strategy to shape laws, the content and substance of those laws, the tools that accompany the laws, and then in the rulemaking process. So it's really important that their leadership and their voices are centered. And we saw this firsthand in New Jersey. These are some of the organizations that were core to the coalition in New Jersey. We're very fortunate that in New Jersey, we have a very tight-knit environmental justice community who have been working together collaboratively for decades. And so we have the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, the Ironbound Community Corporation, which is based in Newark, New Jersey, the South Ward Environmental Alliance, also in Newark, with the help of Earth Justice, Tishman Center, Clean Water Action. And full disclosure, I'm a trustee of the New Jersey EJ Alliance and Ironbound Community Corporation. So I was heavily involved as a trustee and not just as an academic. And we respectfully worked with allies, not just in the environmental movement, but in our partners in labor, in the civil rights and social justice organizations around the state, with urban mayors coalitions, to really try to do a lot of education and awareness raising around environmental justice issues and the law itself, to garner increased interest and support for the law, and then also for the rulemaking process. I will just mention at the top that unlike other states, New Jersey did not begin with the formation of a tool that then led to a law. The process in New Jersey really came out of a legislative push, because advocates kept asking New Jersey regulators to deny permits in communities that were clearly overburdened, places like Newark and Trenton and Camden. And the state consistently came back and said, we understand there's an environmental justice problem, but we don't have the legal authority to deny permits on the basis of cumulative impacts. We don't have the legislative directive. We don't have the regulations that allow us to do that, because there's nothing in the law that says you should take into consideration cumulative impacts. And so we, even while we disagreed with that legal interpretation of what the state could or couldn't do, we took that seriously and went back to our legislative strategy and pushed a law that could clearly send the message to the regulators that says, yes, you are now tasked with reviewing permits under the condition of cumulative impacts, and you have the full authority to deny permits. So the law, one of the key aspects of the New Jersey law, is to tell the state that you have the right, that you must, that you not, you shall deny a permit on the basis of disproportionate impact. So it's not a may. And that was a really important win for our community. We knew that we had, decades of evidence and the lived experience of cumulative burdens, and we didn't want to waste a lot of time doing a law that just built a tool that then someday might lead to, a regulatory approach. We wanted a law that then established the basis on which to then say, okay, now we need a tool to implement the law. And so we went the other way around. We have a law, we have definitions of what an overburdened community are. Now go, create a tool and a map that can help us implement that law. So that's a little bit different than what other states are doing. You'll see that the time it took us to get to the implementation of the rule was quite significant. We originally were anticipating a year, maybe 2 years to get the rule developed, and it took 2.5 years. It took longer than any of us probably anticipated early on, but it was an important process. We learned a lot, and I'll say one of the most important things that we did as advocates is we worked very closely with our state regulators, with the folks in the New Jersey DEP, both the legal and legal experts and the technical experts who were writing the rule, who were drafting the rule. Now, we met with the DEP on a regular basis prior to the formal public comment period. And, we had informal conversations where we listened to the formation and the ideas coming out of DEP. We offered our own technical advice and expertise on the direction, on key directions and pieces of the legislation that we thought could be implemented. So it was an opportunity to really inform both of our thinkings. It wasn't just a one-way exchange of information. It was us sharing, but also the DEP sharing what they're learning. We asked fellow academics and experts around the country to come in and give their expertise on the technical aspects of the rule. So it was a real learning exchange. And then we entered a formal public comment period, but even before the formal stakeholder meetings were held before the formal public comment period, and I give a lot of credit to DEP, they held many series of stakeholder meetings across the state. It's a very technical and dense rule. So this is a very challenging topic to hold stakeholder meetings about. So it requires the ability to translate this information in a very comprehensible and accessible way. And the coalition of EJ advocates had to do a lot of work also informing our constituents, organizing our communities to come out to stakeholder meetings, ask questions, get clarification. So we had to do our own educational campaign around the rulemaking and the public comment period. And we submitted comments throughout the process, both before the public comment period and during the public comment period. So we offered technical comments throughout the process. And we organized our communities to come out to offer public testimony. And I'll just say that before the final rule was adopted, it sat in the governor's office for longer than we had hoped. And we had to push as a coalition to get it out of the governor's office and get it signed. So even in the final stages, it requires significant organizing. And we knew that there was quite a bit of opposition from the industries to some of the provisions of the rule. The DEP had a very strong rule that aligned well with the Coalition of Environmental Justice Advocates recommendations. But we had to dispel a lot of misinformation that was out in the public. So a lot of our role was also to help inform the public about what was actually in the rule and what was not in the rule, because there was a lot of misinformation happening at the legislative level, in the public. So that was a really important role that the coalition played. And you'll note there that after the final rules adoption, we did have legal, there has been a legal notice of appeal by 2 industry groups, which we had anticipated. But I'll just say that the process with DEP was early, was consultative, and it was substantive. And I think it made the rule stronger. And I think it's a really important part of the conversations is to keep those lines of communication open between the EJ Coalition organizations and the folks writing the rules. And I'll just mention that some of the key areas that we worked on for 2.5 years with the DEP was around the compelling public interest, which was a huge topic of debate. It became the focus of almost all the public testimonies in the public comment period, because the industry really tried to drive a huge hole in the rule by allowing economic interests to weigh in as compelling public interests. And that would basically create a huge loophole in the rule that would allow almost any development can claim economic benefit. And that's exactly what has happened historically to communities, why they have so many polluting industries, and what the rule was trying, the law was trying to combat. So we really pushed hard on pushing back the narrative around economics versus environmental pollution. And the communities came out very strongly to support the rule, and that was it showed up in the public testimony. We also had a lot of debate around the stressor data sets. I will say that in the end, the communities that were in the coalition felt very good about the stressor data sets, that those were the most robust. In our ideal world, we'd have a lot more robust data sets available at the block group, but we felt very strongly that the stressors data sets that were selected were covered enough of our communities and gave enough indicators that was really robust enough to provide coverage. The unit of comparison for assessing relative burden and the methodology to calculate that threshold of 50%, that was also a huge topic of debate. Because that determination of a threshold, is it 50%? Is it 80%? Is it 90%? That is not simply a technical question. That is a political and moral question. Okay, what is fair? What is reasonable? And that is a very, I would say, you know, subjective idea that has to be well negotiated and very thought out and thoughtful. And so environmental justice communities must be part of that determination of a threshold. That can't just be left to technical experts and to modelers. They have to be engaged in that threshold determination. And then we had other areas that we debated. I'm happy to actually share some of the content of those comments. They're quite technical, but I'll just say that anticipate that industry opposition will come into play and that there will be attempts at weakening and watering down the original intent of your rule and your law. So you have to be prepared to be organized and ensure that the intent of the law remains intact and that you build in public education and organizing throughout all the phases of the rulemaking process, even before the public comment period happens, and anticipate legal challenges. You know, we looked at the law very carefully, as I'm sure DEP did, to ensure that, you know, what was included in the law was substantiated by existing precedent. And we also had quite a bit of lessons learned from other laws around the country. I'll say that my center, I'll put in a plug, did contribute a data set, and we have a tool online that lists all the policies both enacted and proposed of other states, as well as policies from the federal government that can be reference points as well. So if somebody tells you it can't be done or it's never been done, you can look at this data set and see where it has been done and the methodologies used for that. So yeah, I'll stop here.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Baptista, for sharing what you shared, and Ms. Perry as well. I really appreciate, I mean, I'm just sitting here back as a Minnesotan growing up on the north side of Minneapolis, and some people might know what that means. We're still battling these issues. So how you've shared those pieces about engaging community, coming up with standards and staying in the fight has been very inspiring. I want to go into the Q&A section, and there are folks on this team that are helping with that Q&A. So I want to make sure they feel like they can pop in as well. But I don't know if you've been looking at it, but I'm going to start with Nahid's comment. And if that's okay, I'm going to read it and then see if you all want to respond that way. Does that sound okay? Or would you rather read it yourselves as presenters and pick how you want to go? Okay, I'll start with Nahid. He says, I respectfully but strongly request that MPCA include mobile source of air pollution. And they put in stressors, traffic/cars and trucks of all sizes, plus railways. In all your investigations and analysis of cumulative air impacts, which currently seem to include only fixed location, non-mobile facilities. Therefore, freeways, highways, expressways, et cetera, as structures might be studied now, but the impacts of air pollution of the traffic using them appears not to be included. This is a serious oversight and gap in how you are supposedly addressing cumulative impacts of air pollution. So I guess it's a question, you know, about how do you see that as a gap?
Sure, I'll start. Hi, everybody. Just quick introductions for myself. If you don't know me, my name's Hassan Boucherab. I'm an engineer here at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency in our air policy unit, and I'm coordinating this rulemaking effort. Nahid, great question. And maybe just to start too, maybe I'll ask, you know, Esther and Kandyce and Anna, if as we're kind of going through some of these things, if you have thoughts that you want to chime in with too, please feel free to do so. Because kind of just to quickly share my hope for this session is that, you know, I'm here to learn too. You know, we're bringing in folks from different parts of the country that have done something similar or very close to what we're undertaking now, and hoping to learn from them who have gone a little bit farther than where we are, you know. So for Nahid, your question, sort of, or your comment here in particular, kind of this is I think what Anna was talking about too. You know, there's parts of this legislative bill, this rule, this law that came out that tells us specifically what we are allowed to do. It gives us certain authority in certain areas. I would say in particular for how we think about mobile sources, traffic and cars and things like that, the legislature was pretty clear of when this analysis will happen, but that doesn't mean we're ignoring those sources of air pollution. This analysis might not be done for a highway because a highway doesn't receive an air quality permit from the PCA, but we do consider and we do, pay attention to what's going on from emissions wise from things like traffic and other mobile sources. So that might weigh into something that looks at air quality in, North Minneapolis or in the Phillips neighborhood or something like that, right? But so that could play into this analysis. It's not like it's just going to be cut out and ignored. So we totally understand the importance of your question, of your comment here. I don't know, and anybody else from PCA, feel free to jump in too, or Anna, Kandyce, and Esther, if you want to jump in and add any helpful context from your perspectives. Maybe you've received similar questions like this and when you were developing the rules.
I'll just mention that in the cumulative impacts data set that we compiled across multiple states, that the traffic proximity and traffic related emissions was a data set that was quite common in a lot of cumulative impacts modeling tools. And maybe Esther, you can confirm that, but it tends to be a data set that states have and is easily accessible and can be, I know in New Jersey, we had that data set available that was quite consistent. And so if you have, I think if you have those data sets available to you in the covered areas that are in the law, then you should look at all the potential, just like DEP did. Let's look at everything that's possible and see what is robust enough that we can use and that gets at these stressors.
Yeah, Esther here. Washington State, we do actually have an indicator around kind of proximity to major roadways because of the very reason that people are raising. And Department of Ecology is actually working on refining that data more, because after like the major roadways, like you start getting kind of granular and more fine with the data, because that's what we're trying to do with the data. So it's still a work in progress, but we do have our first version of the indicator had that, and we're continuing to tweak and do encourage MPCA to continue to think about those as well.
Yeah, and just to add on as a last thought, it's really important to have stressor data like this included, because it helps you to regulate, it helps you to address things that you may not be able to regulate. So in New Jersey, one of the facilities that is not subject to the EJ law is warehouses. And so that was brought up and continues to be brought up a number of times. In New Jersey, we just don't have a good data set for where warehouses are located throughout the state. And so at this time, it's just not subject to the law, but by having mobile source as a stressor within the regulations in our tool, we're able to capture and address if a warehouse needed a stormwater permit, for example. We can address the cumulative stressors and not just look at just the stormwater. So proxies are really important.
Excellent, excellent. I'm going to move on to the next question. And Willis posed it at the bottom. They pose, and it's related. Do you have any plans to make assessments more holistic in this manner? And so they're talking about really being holistic. It's a long statement. I'll let you all read that.
Let's see. So yeah, I think, again, this raises a really, a good point in general. I'd say, again, we're hoping to learn from, I don't plan on having a lot of answers today because, we're here to help learn from the other folks, Kandyce, Esther, and Anna. I think, again, here we have bring up some great points of things that we should or can think about. I think, again, we have to work within the bounds that our legislature provided for us for this rule. But I think there's some great things to think about in this comment as far as how we can look at something like a stressor, any of those suggestions that you put together, like a stressor that could be wrapped into a cumulative impact analysis. And again, Esther, Anna, and Kandyce, if there's anything you want to add, feel free.
Yeah, I'll just say that, another reason why our EJ mapping tool is not codified into law, but we did it outside of the law and the regulations is so that we can update our list of stressors and the tool outside of that process and not have to worry about going through the legislature or doing a whole rulemaking effort to update our tool. So we will explore, to the extent that there is really robust and meaningful data sources, we will explore including them. The 26 is what we came up with for our 2023 adoption, but it's not to say that we're limited to just those 26.
Okay, I'm looking at Mai's comment. How much engagement have you gotten from impacted community members / Black groups when there have been permits pulled? Who wants to address that one?
Yeah, I'll take it. So no permits have been pulled just yet. The rules were adopted in April 2023, and we have 5 applications that are subject to our environmental justice regulations now in January, soon to be made public and posted on our website. We're doing some back and forth with the applicants just to make sure that their environmental justice impact statements are up to muster and ready for public view. Kind of working with them on our expectations of that document, being mindful that when the first is published, it will set a precedent and that other applicants in New Jersey will be looking at those first few as templates. So soon to be published, but we're just very early on in our implementation of the regulations. And so we just have 5, have not yet gotten to the stage of posting or publishing a public notice for public hearings just yet.
I'll just mention one other thing that I forgot to say, which is DEP did another interesting thing because we knew the rulemaking process turned out to be longer than we anticipated, that period of time. In the meantime, permits were still coming in for review that would have been subject to the rule, but the rule is not yet enacted. So what DEP stepped up to do was actually implement an administrative order, which served as using their existing regulatory authority to apply additional review processes to those any permits that would have been subject to the rule that were coming in the interim. And that just allowed another layer of scrutiny and review. They weren't subject to the rule in the same way, but at least it added another layer of public process and scrutiny, because we did see, the community was afraid that there would be this uptick of permit applications in overburdened communities while the state was developing the rule. And if that period takes a long extended period of time, you may want to consider what can you do in the interim to be able to apply some level of scrutiny with the existing authority you do have.
Thank you for sharing that. Sounds very strategic and important to capture that time. Go ahead, Hassan.
Anna, can I ask a quick follow-up question to that? And maybe Kandyce too. I was looking through New Jersey's rule the other week, and I thought I remembered seeing something in there about how permit applications that were submitted, I think before the effective date, weren't. So how did that sort of mesh with kind of what you were just saying there, Anna? With the rule saying one thing, yes, you can obviously, ask facilities to an industry to go through more, but did you get a lot of pushback there, or how, I was just kind of was curious now.
Yeah, I can start. We have about 125 applicants that were subject to the administrative order, and I just dropped the link to that in the chat. Maybe about half of those have fully made their way through that process. No, I wouldn't say that we've gotten pushback from applicants, like in our request to ask them to comply with the administrative order. I think many of them are seeing it as an opportunity to kind of test the waters and see how an environmental justice rule process would go. So if you're subject to the AO and you kind of bypass being subject to the environmental justice rules, it'll come back around in your renewal, maybe 5 years later. So we didn't get pushback. And so what we do is we don't require them to do an environmental justice impact statement. We can't, but we require them to meet with the community and have a public hearing. And so that's well within our authority to just have a meeting. You know, that's all we're asking you to do, just have a meeting. And the thing that we do is based on the testimony and the public comment, we can set conditions. Now, conditions that are within our scope and existing authorities. There's some things we can't do just based on not having the regulations in place. But, you know, we can think creatively and use our existing authorities to set conditions, like a dust management plan, for example.
No, that makes perfect sense. Thank you. Because I know we're hearing from folks, and I probably a few people on this call have made this comment in particular, is ask that question: what happens in between now and, you know, the final rule?
There are several questions about building community in here and how do you build trust? And there are, let me see, there's a specific one too on also talking about the public comment period, all of those things. Can you talk a little bit about more how you built trust in there?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to make it sound like it was a kumbaya. We had spent, you know, most of the EJ advocates basically were in the business of beating up DEP and going to, you know, public hearing after public hearing to be like, why are you putting another polluting facility in our community? That was our relationship, you know. But in the process of creating the rule, we had to shift our stance, because now we have the ability, with the intent of the law and strong legislative support and mandate, to work lockstep with the DEP to form a really strong rule. So we had to form a basis of a working relationship, right? And that doesn't mean we always agreed, but we at least had open lines of communication. So the informal the environmental justice groups were meeting informally prior to the public comment period, which, by the way, is something industry groups do all the time. They come into the regulators' offices and say, oh, before their permit is even submitted, to do consultations. But EJ advocates rarely do that, right? We rarely come to the table before the process is initiated. And so we did that early, and we did it often. We had a very receptive, we were lucky to have receptive DEP staff who had worked with us prior, and it was a forum in which to share ideas early, test the waters with each other openly in an informal process before we had to put everything on the record. And so that commitment to meeting on a regular basis bi-weekly helped us build trust, so that we knew there might be areas where we weren't going to agree ultimately in the public comment period, but we could anticipate some of that. We could bring forward our best arguments and kind of try to shape the strongest possible rule together. The public comment, and meanwhile, the industry was also meeting with DEP. They had the same access that EJ groups had if they wanted it. And similarly, in the stakeholder process, there were stakeholder meetings for everyone. They were open to everyone. So EJ groups and industry groups participated in that process and in the public comment process. So it was one of the first times, though, that EJ groups were, I think, participating more actively and more often in the informal comment period, which I think is really important. In Minnesota, you all should be talking to your EJ advocates early and often. Don't wait till the public comment period to be in a defensive stance around what you agree and don't agree on. I think it's better to surface those things early and learn together in this process. Because then when you get to the public comment period, and you need to organize and really have full information and transparency, that those relationships and lines of communication are there. So yeah, like for example, there's 26 stressors. We were always fighting for more stressors, but then in those conversations back and forth with DEP, it became clear that we were getting down to the stressors that were most robust, most defensible, and at the end of the day, painted enough of a picture of what was happening that was sufficient to meet the goals of the law, right? So that wasn't where we were gonna spend a lot of energy fighting.
I hear you. Well, we are at 7:20, or sorry, 2:27. And I just wanted to acknowledge that poor Anna got locked out of the meeting with computer issues. So the other Anna Peters. So I just wanted to thank everyone and make sure we close out and with Maggie saying some comments and also knowing that there are other comments that we will definitely address and go through. Did PCA want to close us out and tell us what's next?
Yeah, thank you, Vanessa, and thank you to all of our speakers. It was really wonderful to hear from you, and I know that even the New Jersey rule is kind of still new in a lot of ways, and so we'll be watching you very carefully. We already have been, as will many of the people on this call. Thank you all for coming. It's really wonderful to see such robust participation as we move through this early stage of the rule development. We do want to hear from you. You know, to Anna's point and to Candyce's, the more we hear things now, we can make a rule that is strong and defensible. You know, once we get to a hearing in 2026, that'll be kind of where it'll be in a very formal part of the process. Vanessa just dropped a survey in that will help us shape the next few of these sessions. We do not have a date or a topic to announce yet because we want to hear from you. And as you may recall, for those of you who worked on the statute, there is a requirement that any public meetings we hold around this rule require a 30-day public notice. So it will be at least 30 days from now, but we will send that out through the Gov delivery list that many of you are on and through our social media channels. We really appreciate those of you who have been helping us spread the word. We know that you know people who are interested in this, and the more we can continue to grow who is engaged in this process. We really appreciate your help with that. If you did not get here through our Gov delivery sort of e-newsletter subscription, please sign up. That link was at the top and we can put it back in again. But thank you again for all your time, and thank you to DeYoung and our speakers.